Hi, it's Allison from the Law School Toolbox. Today, we're excited to have attorney and podcaster Ingrid Busson-Hall here with us to talk about networking, building community, and navigating legal workplaces. Welcome, Ingrid.
Thanks, Allison. So happy to be here.
I'm super excited to have you. To start us off, can you just give our listeners a bit of information about your background so they have some context here?
Sure. So I am a proud Canadian expat living in Brooklyn, New York. I've been in the US for 30 plus years. I came to college and law school here in the US, and I have spent my career 25 plus years in the law, most of it in-house, but I started in private practice at Skadden Arps. And then really my practice has focused on regulatory enforcement work in financial services. So I've been in large corporate investment banks like Morgan Stanley, Crédit Agricole, a large French conglomerate financial services company. And most recently, I was at PayPal in the payment services industry and sort of exploring that fintech side of the regulatory enforcement world.
That all sounds very intense.
No lie, some of it has been pretty intense for sure. I should have mentioned that it was an interesting start for me at Skadden. I actually never styled myself as someone even remotely prepared to advise financial services companies or executives in financial services, whether asset management or banks. I went to Vermont Law School. I studied environmental law, and that's what I thought I would be doing. And pretty quickly, as I'm sure you know, and many of your listeners may be finding out as they spend those initial few years of their career, it doesn't always go to plan, right? And that's not a bad thing. That's just a life thing. But I started out at Skadden as a tobacco defense litigator. I turned that into financial services regulation within the first 3 years, but I got a lot of core skills down in those first 3 years when I was a mass torts litigator, and then found opportunities to lift and shift when I could.
Right. I think that's so true. I mean, I did not plan on being a patent litigator, which in retrospect made sense. You know, I'd done programming before I went to law school. I didn't take a single IP class in law school. And it wasn't until I was working for a judge and we had a case and I had the source code to a Google Earth or something on my desk. And I was like, oh, this is kind of cool. He's like, yeah, you're actually like, this is useful. You understand this. You can talk to the engineers.
Yep.
Maybe you should look into doing this. And I was like,
Yeah.
not a bad idea. And if people want to learn more about you or reach out, how can they do that?
Oh, yeah, for sure. A couple of things. My professional world, if you will, lives on LinkedIn. I just recently founded a crisis management firm, since that's really what I've been doing for the vast majority of my career, is working with companies, executives on navigating crises of one sort or another. So Pierpont Solutions, LLC, is my consultancy. We're building the website, so stay tuned for more on that. But LinkedIn is a good way to connect with me professionally. For the podcast that you mentioned, I do have this creative side that I've given some license through a podcast called This Is My Silver Lining, which I started a couple of years ago with a very good friend of mine. You can go to thisismysilverlining.com to find out more information there. And just a shameless plug for Timsel. That's a show really that we created to disrupt the very heavy negative news cycle, and where we shine a light on stories of human courage, grace, gratitude, and community. And we talk to some really amazing, wonderful people. So you can check us out there and on Instagram and also on LinkedIn.
Awesome. We will link to all of that in the show notes. And I looked at the website. You have some super interesting guests. So definitely going to be subscribing to that one. Actually, one of the stories that I love from that website is that you met your podcast co-host many years ago, 20 plus years ago, because you were both overdressed for your first day as law firm associates. So tell me a little more about that. And also, I'm curious, what are some of the strategies that you've used over time to bond with people like this? This is someone you met randomly, and now you're doing a podcast with 20 years later. What have you been doing to keep in touch with people and build those relationships?
Oh, yeah. Listen, this is one of my favorite topics, the power of connection and community. So Kathleen Merrigan is a very good friend of mine. And yes, you're right. We met on the first day in the HR lobby at Skadden Arps at 4 Times Square. And we were both super nervous. This was our first big time law job for sure. This was in fall of 2000, to date myself. And all of the law firms following the lead of their large corporate investment bank clients had just announced that they would be business casual going forward during the week. They had gone business casual over the summer of 2000. And somehow we missed the memo. Again, please, listeners who, take social media and iPhones, Android devices for granted. We didn't have them. We had flip cell phones and texting was not a thing. So we were overdressed, ill-informed, super eager, and we made fast friends. And yeah, Kathleen is one of my dearest friends in life. We've known each other for a long time and seen each other through a lot. But to your question on how to stay in touch with folks, I guess I'm one of those people who just loves engaging with others, obviously with friends and family and people that I know, but I really do love the encounter with a stranger and just asking. I'm a really curious person. I ask a lot of questions. And so I think I just naturally have this ability to meet and engage with folks and to leave a mark such that people remember me if I reach out a week later, a month later, and frankly, several years later. Why is that? I don't know. I think that's a combination of listening to people when they speak and really noting the details. I'm grateful for having a very good memory. And so I capture details. I'll remember what someone wore or someone told me about their grandma or a work war story, whatever it is. I like to follow up with people, and I reach out on a rather regular basis with people that I find really interesting and check in with folks. I do the whole, I found an article. I thought you might find this interesting.
I'm like the queen of that. My friends are like,
Right?
how much are you reading?
Yeah, and how do you have time for that? The assumption is that I've read absolutely cover to cover this whole thing, right? You don't, and you don't have to. But if someone tells you that they're really animated about, I don't know, emerging antitrust issues in Asia, it's not hard to pick up on a couple of things and send someone an article. But it doesn't have to be limited to the law, right? It can be personal, not like uber personal, but I just recently traveled to Morocco. First time, went with my family, was really amazing. You can well imagine if anyone has Morocco remotely on their radar screen in my future, I'm going to be like, hey, I'd love to chat with you about that. Or if you're thinking about it, definitely have this on your radar. So you can definitely delve into that divide between professional and personal as you're connecting with folks. And the last thing I'll say, which I think is super, super important, is, and we'll get into the core of networking later, the thing that I think a lot of people lose sight of is the power of really just bringing people together. So I know a lot of people. Kathleen, who we mentioned before, knows a lot of people. Say we're in conversation, Allison, and you tell me that you have a friend who's moving to Fairfield, Connecticut, and you just don't know where to give her some help because you're out on the West Coast. Kathleen lives in Fairfield, Connecticut.
There you go.
So I love the magic can happen all over the place. It's just really thinking about, it's not just about you and what can I get out of this relationship. That's so mercenary and frankly kind of icky. And maybe in life you got to do that sometimes. But it's so much more powerful if it's about helping other people and putting them in a room together, virtual or actual.
Oh, I 100% agree. And Lee, my business partner, is also, she knows everybody. Anyone in the entire country who needs a referral for a lawyer, she probably has a friend who knows somebody who's perfect.
Exactly.
And she's very happy to do that. But she's my source for I have this really random request. She's like, oh, I've got the perfect person. Let's talk about networking because everyone hates networking. But I think it is because people think that networking is about finding people that you're going to ask for stuff and they're going to do things. My approach has always been more like you. I'm curious. I remember things. I send articles.
Yeah.
So then when I do need to reach out and it's hey, I'm wondering about this thing or I'm, looking for this, people are there and they don't feel like necessarily I've been taking advantage of them for the past 20 years. You sort of have to build that bucket of favors you can call in. But at the same time, you're not doing it just for that reason that maybe down the road I'm going to need a favor.
Exactly. And Oh, listen, this comes in so many ways over the course of a lifetime, a career. And for your listeners who may just be starting out and really approach the whole networking thing with like a lot of trepidation, I think it's sort of like that message that gets reinforced over time, right? Oh, networking, ugh, like
Ugh.
it's icky.
Yeah,
And you
gross.
got to just turn the volume down on that and call it something else if that's helpful, right? The whole idea of a network is one point leads to another, and it's not linear, right? You're a web, casting and creating a web of connections that grows over the course of time. And that's just cool in and of itself. I also appreciate the fact that I trend towards the more extroverted, right? I don't mind going into a room full of people that I don't know. By the way, that wasn't always the case, so I'll come back to that. But I fully appreciate that some people are more introverted and more reserved and don't really enjoy like navigating a room or really know how to show up one-on-one in a coffee kind of setting. The point is, this is a muscle you have to grow. And for some people, it's easier than others, but it literally is like going to the gym. The first few sessions, you come back and the next day you're like sore all over. You're like, oh my God, I don't want to do that ever again. But then you're like hooked and you're like, oh, I want to keep doing that. At least that's been my experience. It's like anything. The more you do it, the more at ease you'll be with it and the more you'll enjoy it. I have to tell this story because when I graduated from law school, I didn't have a job. It didn't start at Skadden for me. My first year out of law school was a lot of hard knocks and a lot of falling down, getting back up, and like hitting the literal pavement with my resume. No LinkedIn at the time. And a colleague of mine said, well, you got to go to these events. I found this thing. You said you do environmental law. You should go to this event. I don't know anybody. I don't know anyone here. She's like, but you got to just get yourself out there. I got to give a shout out to Anissa Obasi. By the way, we intermittently connect, but we're not in one another's spheres of influence anymore. But I think about her all the time when I talk about this topic because she was the one who pushed me out the door. I was like, listen, you just got to do more of this. And it's fine. If you have a bad conversation, move on. It really doesn't matter at the end of
Right.
the day. And so networking can be horrible if you think about it as being horrible. It's eating your broccoli. But
I
like,
love broccoli now.
exactly. And maybe that broccoli turns into ice cream because it ends up being a lot more fun and you put sprinkles and whatever you want on it. But bottom line, you just got to get out there and do it. I could talk about networking all day long. And frankly, I should have said this at the top if people want to connect. I'm happy to connect with folks because I do think this is really important. You're going to ask people for help, and people are so willing to help, by the way, but be willing to offer up the help. And so I've always taken that on as a privilege and a responsibility. And I'm here and open to talking to young lawyers about networking and unlocking the secrets.
Well, that is very generous. Thank you. And I do think, I'm kind of borderline introvert, extrovert, and also I can project extrovert if I'm at one of these things. But a lot of it is just you've got to get comfortable with the techniques. My strategy was always if I don't know anybody here and I'm feeling a little awkward and I don't want to break into a group of conversation, why don't I just stand by the food or drink table? Then it's like, oh, have you tried the squash quiche, like, oh, isn't it great?
Exactly.
And then you have a friend and that person's probably also looking around being like, oh my God, I don't know anyone and no one's talking to me.
Exactly. Yeah, listen, 100% of the events that you will go to, someone or many someones are feeling exactly the kind of nerves that you are feeling. Whether you've been 3 months, 3 weeks out of law school or 6 years or 20 years. Some people just feel nervous. And sometimes I go to events and I'm like, oh, I'm not feeling it. I don't want to dive into the conversation. So I'll sit back. But you got to just try. And I think for a lot of young lawyers, the fear is, or the going proposition is, I just graduated, or I just started practicing, or I'm just like looking at documents all day, or whatever it is. I'm not that important and I don't have that much to say. Who wants to talk to me? I could never talk to Jane Smith, the speaker who just told us all about the most recent, greatest developments in the Supreme Court. Why not? Literally,
I mean,
that's
they're there.
person. They're there. They're a person. Just embrace the fear and go for it. Approach someone, surprise yourself, and just walk into the fray. And you are an interesting person. If you went to law school and got through that and the bar and all of the stuff, you've got some interesting things to say.
And also, the reality is most people just love to talk about themselves. So you can just ask a few
Well,
questions and
yes,
sit
Alice.
back and nod and smile. And then they're like, wow, that person was so great. I really liked them.
Yeah. You're reminding me of another piece, though. If you really want to take the best advantage of a situation, especially a one-on-one, and this is like table stakes if you're meeting someone for coffee or for lunch or what have you, and especially if they've been connected to you by a friend or a colleague. But it also applies if you're going to a conference or if you're going to a cocktail party. Figure out who's going to be there and do your research. There's literally in 2024 no excuse for not doing your research. Everybody's got a LinkedIn profile. Everybody's been out there somehow. And so you can pick up some details and be like, oh, I read this article that you wrote, or I saw that you recently spoke at blah, 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 or I hear you like basket weaving. Whatever it is, demonstrate that you care enough to do research about the person that you're interested in meeting.
Definitely. And that is such a lawyer trait, too. I was talking to someone else who's going to be on the podcast, and he was like, oh, I've done my research on you. I'm like, of course you have. You're an attorney. We all do our research, you know?
Exactly.
Like, you're not going to show up having no idea who you're talking to.
Exactly.
Yeah, anyway, it's such a lawyer trait. Lawyers they're a funny breed. You've had a variety of different roles in the legal profession. You've worked in a lot of different environments. What are some themes that you've seen or experienced just in terms of finding some way to be yourself in these very corporate types of spaces?
Yeah. I think this one naturally brings us to talking about the visual expression, right? We're talking
Yeah.
about clothing. We're talking about
What do we wear? That's
footwear.
always
What do we wear?
that's like such a thing. It's
Like,
amazing that's still such a thing, but it is.
but it is, right? And I don't know that ever goes away. And there are probably some really good reasons for that. And whether they're, I'm not saying good qualitatively, like that's a great thing, but we categorize naturally. And the main way we do that is visually. And so, are you like me? Are you not like me? And I think in corporate environments, they come in all shades and grades. I've worked in uber conservative environments and really casual environments, especially most recently when I did a stint in fintech at PayPal. People could wear sweatpants to work or jeans, things that even on the worst snow day you wouldn't wear to a corporate law firm. And so I think there, I would say a couple of things. I really value my individuality, right? I don't know if folks are seeing this visually or not, but like I'm wearing a bright pink puffy vest because it's a little cold in my house. This is not unusual. I'm always in a pop or full on color because that's who I am in the world. And was it always the case that I could fully express myself through color and outfits and scarves and footwear and whatever of my choice? No, I moderated depending on the corporate culture that I was operating in. Like I said, at Skadden that first day, everybody is wearing, they're not wearing flip-flops for work, but people were a lot more casual. Kathleen and I really stood out because we're wearing our like black pinstripe suits. So obviously the next day we made some adjustments. And that's what we do. I think it's sad when people really put their own visual expression on the shelf in favor of completely blending in. That isn't a way to live, and I think that's really hard over time. I think you got to read your environment though, because unless you're the CEO of name a tech company and you can afford, I don't know, really expensive black turtlenecks or sweatshirts,
Or hoodies.
or hoodies, exactly. Choose your black item of choice. I will never be one such executive. Why? Because I own literally no black.
I'm the opposite. I'm pretty much all black all the time. If I wear a color, everyone's wow, that's interesting. You don't wear that. It is funny though. When I was interviewing at OCI, I was in New York, and it was like I could do the straight black suit, the Brooks Brothers. I was like, but I can't totally do that because it's just going to drive me crazy. So I went with the Thomas Pink. So I had these really loud Thomas Pink shirts, like the bright stripes. And I remember I showed up to an interview and one of my classmates was like, "Oh, that's really brave." And I literally had no idea what they were talking about. I'm like, "What do you mean?" They're like, "What you're wearing." I'm like, "This shirt? Are you joking?" Like, what? It's a shirt. What difference is it? This is not brave.
It's true. This is one comment that I have had in pretty much every working environment I've been in is, wow, you wear a lot of color. And I feel like if I think back on it, some of those were pretty like snide remarks, but I just kept right on going.
Like,
that's kind of who I am in the world. That said, I wouldn't wear a bright pink suit to a court hearing or a meeting with a regulator, right?
Right.
You gotta know your audience. And this one's really important in the law. I get that there's resistance to this, and some of this is generational, although not all of it. If you're going to court, there are still some really arcane rules that apply.
Unspoken rules, mostly.
Mostly unspoken, except the whispers are there, right? And you can do your research. But as horrible as it is, there are judges, and this applies perhaps especially in the most arcane way to women, in a way that I find reprehensible. But I also understand that the world works the way that the world works. And until it's different, here we are. And if you appear in front of certain judges, whether that's in the Southern District or the Eastern District, and you're not wearing a skirt and pantyhose, that's a problem, right? I mean,
True.
I don't think that's okay, but it's just a reality. And so do you want people to judge you for your mind or for what you're wearing or not wearing? There you go. Story on pantyhose. I was working for a French bank, as I mentioned earlier, and I'd been there for a while. I was really well known. I'm half French, so I was like back and forth to France and working with all the expats, and the whole color and style thing worked, I think, better in that environment, perhaps. But I'll always remember I ran into our local CEO's executive assistant, like at the beginning of the summer when it started, like the heat started coming on, and I wasn't wearing pantyhose. And she looked me up and down. She's, "Ingrid, you are not wearing the pantyhose?" This is in the cafeteria around a whole bunch of other people. And I'm like, "No, I am not wearing the pantyhose. And you will not catch me dead in the pantyhose." Coming in and out of work in July and August in New York City, riding the subway. No.
I grew up in the South where this was like a thing. You had to have the panties. So it was like, do I need them or not? I started just wearing pants at some point. But again, that can be fraught. You're like, is that okay? Are we still having this conversation? Yes, we are. There's a lot going on with the dress. There really is.
There is an important counterpoint to this, though, that I think is worth mentioning, because a lot of your listeners will be at law firms. It's not like you want to go rogue and you want to take cues from the partners that you're working for. But I will say we had some really important things happen when I was at PayPal. We had a few, trying not to use the word incident, but it's the easiest, where we had outside counsel. We had to interview employees in our back office operations. And the law firm partners and the associates, of course, showed up all duded up in their suits and uber proper. And it really intimidated the employees that they were meeting with, such that they couldn't get the best interview experiences to get the best information, which is obviously like mission number one when you're doing those kinds of interviews. And so then I worked with outside counsel who really got it and understood the cue from leadership that was, let's not have that ever happen again. And so it was like jeans, t-shirts, sweatshirts. And so you're reading the audience and knowing what makes the most sense in the environment that you're operating. So it all goes back to what I said earlier about doing your research.
Right. I mean, I have a weird take on this because the firm I worked at in San Francisco is Quinn Emanuel, which they hand out flip-flops on your first day. It's the flip side of this because they're making the point that we're different. We don't wear suits. And I had prepared. I had all these nice business casual outfits I was planning to wear. And I show up the first day and everyone's, "What are you wearing?" So, I had to immediately go out and buy jeans and flip-flops. But it's this thing of you've got to read the room. And there, if you showed up looking too nice, people thought you were interviewing somewhere else.
Yes. Yeah.
Well,
So,
before we wrap up, you kind of alluded to a little bit on this dress piece. It's not a secret. Women tend to face some unique challenges as lawyers. Do you have any advice for law students who are maybe worried about balancing all of the demands that they're going to face in the legal profession?
yeah, I guess the first thing I would say is balance is the hardest thing to apply to a life well lived. In other words, you're always going to have more weight on one side of the scale or the other. And I say this as a mom, a wife, a daughter, a friend, a colleague. I love and appreciate all of the roles that I have. Have I always cared for them equally? That's impossible, right? And so it's really in the moment, on the day to day, and over the long haul, trying to find the best way to manage the interests of those around you, starting from within. Like, what matters to you most today, tomorrow, and over the long term? And I guess part of this only happens, or at least for me, I shouldn't speak for anyone else, but it's taken me a long time to sort out a lot of this. I would say I made a lot of sacrifices when I was a new mom because I really wanted to put the pedal down on my career. And I felt like I waited longer to get married. I waited longer to have kids. And so I was in a pretty set of senior roles in that zone of having my first and my second child. And I didn't feel like I could really take my foot off the gas. And that was hard to do. And with the benefit of hindsight, would I change any of that? I don't know. I don't know. That exercise is super helpful. But I think the two things I would say. One is if you're not filling the gas tank for yourself and taking care of yourself, and this is the whole wellness debate that has seeped in, thankfully, in part because of the pandemic, but it was there beforehand, right? Like, how do we care for ourselves, our mental and physical health, so that we can do the best at work and in our family life and in our social lives? I think that's really important. I've learned to do that more. It's not a practice that I had previously because it just wasn't something I was taught to value. I think that's probably why we get some friction in the workplace between generations, because millennials, Gen Z, and those to come will understand and value those more than we were taught to as Gen Xers and certainly boomers. And so I think that finally is taking hold, but it's really important for each individual to figure that out. That this is especially true for women. I think we are, broad sweeping statement, but we are really hard on ourselves as women. We're critical of ourselves, which then makes us critical of others. Again, this is a generalization, but I think it bears out. And we have to learn to accept our mistakes and our failures. And we're resilient. We get back up, but we don't give ourselves much of a break for our mistakes and failures, in my experience. And I think that is the most important thing to learn early on is fail often, embrace the messiness. If you make a mistake, own up to it, move on, learn from it, but don't hold on to it. A year from now, don't be thinking, oh God, I can't believe I produced that
That
confidential,
typo.
or that I produced that confidential document because these things actually do happen. They're not great. I'm not saying go ahead and do that, but if it happens, it's literally not the end of the world. 20 years from now, will that matter? I have this Post-it note that I keep on my desk, and it's real simple. Ask yourself, will this matter in a year? And for so many things, the answer is going to be no, right? So many
Definitely.
things won't matter in a year.
And so much of
So
it also just becomes a
perspective,
good story at some point,
right? Yeah.
particularly if it's not your story. You're not the one who did it.
Well, there's that. There's that.
But yeah, no, I completely agree. And I think that's such an interesting, I mean, we could have a whole discussion about this. I think it's such an interesting interplay between the legal mindset where it's like mistakes just cannot happen. And like mistakes do happen. And the tech mindset where it's like move fast, break things, and then figure it out. So it's interesting, you having been in both, I've been in both too.
Yeah.
I think sometimes people in the legal profession think this is just the way the world is. Actually, it's not. And maybe that's not the best way to be doing this. Nothing is perfect. It's never going to be perfect. Let's just deal with it.
No, it's so true. This quest for perfection that is non-existent. It is really interesting having, like you said, spent time in this world of real deep conflict, right? Being a lawyer in the tech sphere.
Yeah,
And
very
because
bizarre world.
yeah, and you don't want things to break, but then you have to accept that they will. And that one of your roles as a risk manager is to help mitigate that damage and solve the problems that inevitably come. But you can't live in a world without risk, right? And frankly, there would be no work for lawyers if there was a world without risk. It's actually my favorite interview question. I always end interviews with candidates with two questions. How do you define risk? Tell me about a risk you've taken. And amazing the answers that you get or don't get from that question. And then tell me something about you that's personal that I can help remember the person. But this question on risk, especially of lawyers, it's really hard for lawyers to really navigate what is risk, what's risk tolerance, and how do you live in a world of risk? We don't live in bubble wrap. So just fall down, get messy, pick yourself up, know that there's a community of people who will help you learn from those mistakes. That's living.
Definitely. Well, we are pretty much out of time. Any final thoughts you would like to share here?
Well, I would just like to encourage listeners to really listen to your podcast because I think you're really offering young lawyers a really interesting set of like perspectives and tips and guidance that can really serve them today and going forward. And I would just say enjoy what you're doing and know that there are lots of twists and turns ahead and you just got to be prepared for the unexpected and know that it's going to be okay.
Yeah, I think that's totally true. You just never know quite what's coming, but you're probably going to be able to deal with it. Well, thank you so much for joining us and remind us again how people can find out more about you or reach out to you.
Yeah, absolutely. Coming soon, pierpontsolutions.com. This is My Silver Lining is the podcast. So this is mysilverlining.com. Definitely listen, share, follow, all of that good stuff. You can find me on LinkedIn, Ingrid Busson, and also on Instagram.
Thank you, Ingrid. I've so much enjoyed this. Thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
My pleasure. Thank you all for watching, and please subscribe so you don't miss anything. And you can check out lawschooltoolbox.com and reach out with any questions.